This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Todd Phillips' 2019 film Joker continued a trajectory in comic book to big screen adaptations, away from the campy hijinks of turn-of-the-century entries such as Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin or Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, and towards a preference for a certain realism. Where Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy had already excised catchphrases and highly saturated colour palettes, and invited in an added layer of moral complexity, Joker went further, presenting us not with an originless, enigmatic, quick-quipping clown prince of crime, but instead a disenfranchised working-class man whose horrific acts are the product of a mixture of mental ill health and marginalisation. Now, it's worth saying up front that the film's portrayal of the experience of mental ill health has provoked considerable pushback from clinicians. Psychiatrist Vasilis K. Bezois suggested to USA Today that the audience walks away associating the film's protagonist, Arthur Fleck's, violent behaviour, particularly the gun violence, with his mental illness. It reinforces perceptions people might have which are way overblown. Indeed, the film seems to swing between implying that people with mental illness diagnoses are an inherent danger to society and fetishizing mental health conditions as providing an escape from the grueling psychological impact of late capitalism. Whichever emphasis it is exacting at any given moment, the film's characterization of Arthur and its plot more broadly draw a great deal upon reified perceptions of people experiencing mental ill health in a manner which certainly warrants further discussion at the very least. In today's video, however, we're going to be bracketing off some of those concerns. While we're definitely going to be digging into the psyche of Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, I'm not going to speculate over what mental illness the film wants us to believe that he has. Instead, I want to focus on Joker as a marginalised individual, torn between a desire to fit in, even to be celebrated for his comedy act, and a social world which constantly denies him the ability to fulfil that desire. I also want to foreground the character's experience of childhood trauma, as well as the part that he plays in a mother-child relationship which is a direct inversion of that which is generally viewed as the norm. One in which Arthur dutifully cares for a mother who has, in the past, not been so capable of reciprocating. For, taken together, these themes make Joker a useful object of study for exploring a school of psychiatric thought which emerged at the turn of the 20th century, known as psychoanalytic theory. Originated by the Swiss neurologist Sigmund Freud, psychoanalytic theory, and the clinical practice of psychoanalysis, which takes that theory as its basis, argues that although we might like to think of ourselves as being ultimately rational beings, the masters of our own minds, we might not always have the upper hand in our own heads. Our conscious thoughts, Freud argued, coexist alongside other thoughts we're often hardly even aware of. Psychoanalysis argues that our mind holds on to primal urges and desires, as well as traumas, which we often like to assume that we've totally purged ourselves of. And, Freud suggested, these thoughts regularly get the better of us, slipping out into our dreams, our jokes, and our mannerisms. In today's episode of What the Theory, then, we're going to be using Joker as a means to introduce and explore some of Freud's key ideas, as well as to consider how they might be used, not only in the analysis of the psyche of an individual, but in the analysis of cultural texts, such as films, and society more broadly. The central idea of psychoanalysis, as developed by Sigmund Freud, is that the conscious mind, the part of our minds in which we engage in intentional thought, is only one of three coexisting aspects of the human psyche. In his 1899 book, The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud names these three aspects of the human mind: the conscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the unconscious mind. The conscious mind refers to the part of our minds in which we engage in intentional thought. The preconscious mind, by contrast, refers to the portion of our mind in which we store information that we're not presently thinking about, but which we could bring into our conscious mind at any given moment. To use the analogy of a computer, the conscious mind might be said to be similar to RAM. It's the part of our mind in which active thinking takes place. The preconscious mind might thus be thought of as similar to hard drive storage, a vault of information that isn't presently being used, but which we can access whenever circumstances require. The unconscious mind is something altogether different. It contains not information per se, but feelings, urges, and desires. And unlike the preconscious mind, we cannot intentionally access it. It lies beyond the comprehension of deliberate thought. To go back to the analogy of the computer, it is as though the unconscious mind is somehow encrypted, depriving us of the ability to intentionally contemplate the desires, urges, and traumas which lurk within. Though we might not be able to consciously access them, however, this does not mean that the repressed impulses which lie within our unconscious are inert. Freud argued that they regularly assert themselves. Unbeknownst to us, they greatly inform our behaviour and our epistemological relationship with the world around us. Indeed, there are regular moments when one's unconscious seizes the opportunity to leap out and take control of our thoughts and actions. Freud presented a number of examples of the unconscious leaking out in this way, the so-called Freudian slip, such as the schoolchild who accidentally refers to their teacher as mum or dad was one such example. Here, Freud might have argued, the schoolchild's unconscious has momentarily seized control and revealed something about how that pupil conceives of their relationship with their teacher in their unconscious mind. Freud also suggested that the jokes we tell can reveal something about this elusive part of our psyche. He put the greatest emphasis, however, on dreams. When asleep, he suggested that our unconscious minds cede control somewhat, and that our unconscious is thus able to take over. That's not to say that the contents of our dreams are entirely lucid revelations of our unconscious desires. As the title of his book suggests, they still require interpretation. Nevertheless, dreams were, to Freud, the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. Now, we never see Arthur Flack asleep during Joker. There are no moments in which we soft fade from him tossing and turning in bed into the contents of his sleeping mind. He does, however, regularly daydream. There is a moment early in the film, for instance, when Arthur is watching the fictional late-night talk show Live with Murray Franklin. And whilst doing so, he envisages himself there in the live studio audience, being called out onto the stage and being celebrated by the show's host, played by Robert De Niro, for his commitment to caring for his mother. And it is tempting to interpret this daydream on its own terms, and to suggest that Arthur's desire here is simply to appear as a guest on Murray Franklin's show, a desire that is sated by the end of the film. Yet, as I've mentioned, Freud argued that dreams can rarely be read this simply. In order to come to a slightly more Freudian interpretation of Arthur's talk show dream, then, it is necessary to first dig into some of Freud's ideas surrounding our relationships with our immediate family. Before we get on to Oedipus complexes, superegos, and Eeds, however, I want to take a moment to tell you about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for lifelong learners like yourself. They have thousands of awesome classes aimed at helping you build your creative skills. I'm currently loving Rumaan Alam's series on creative writing for all, which is really helping me to rethink how I write the scripts to these videos. Not only have Rumaan's videos helped me to think about stuff like structure and word choice, but also how to be more critical when I'm reading other people's work, so that I can draw on what I found engaging in what I'm currently reading into my own writing. But whether you're things writing, filmmaking, graphic design, or whatever else, Skillshare has a course for you, and an annual subscription comes to just $10 a month. To top things off, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 2-month free trial of premium membership so that you can explore your creativity. Now back to your regularly scheduled content. See, Freud was obsessed by our relationships with our parents. While we might now think of psychoanalytic theory as a purely philosophical approach to discussing mental states, not scientifically accurate, but a useful framework for discussion, it's important to recognise that Freud very much approached it as a science. And as part of this, he was not only interested in how our minds function as we are adults, but also how they developed during childhood. In doing so, he argued that the experiences of our early lives have a huge impact on the formation of our psyche. As Daniel Pick explains, Freud argued that adults are often left struggling with fears and fantasies they were supposed to have left behind in childhood. Some of Freud's most famous ideas surrounding this matter concern our relationships with our mothers and our fathers. In a 1910 paper entitled "A Special Type of Choice of Object Made by Men," Freud coined the term Oedipus complex to refer to the unconscious psychosexual relationship which he considered all boys to have with their mothers. In doing so, he drew upon Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, in which the king and queen of Thebes, on learning of a prophecy that their newborn child would murder his father and marry his mother, abandons him to die on a mountaintop. Oedipus, the child, however, survives, and to cut a long story short, he eventually winds up fulfilling the prophecy by killing his father and marrying his mother. Freud wrote to his friend Wilhelm Fliess that the Greek myth seizes on a compulsion that everyone recognises because he has felt traces of it in himself. Every member of the audience was once a budding Oedipus in fantasy, and this dream fulfillment played out in reality causes everyone to recoil in horror, with the full measure of repression which separates his infantile from his present state. In short, he suggested that all sons have, within their unconscious, a desire to fulfill the prophecy of Oedipus. Somewhere in their unconscious lies a psychosexual desire for their mother and a hatred of their father. In Freud's very heteronormative and patriarchal conception of parenting, he drew focus to the manner in which, in their early lives, the son of a heterosexual couple often has the almost sole attention of their mother. As they grow older, however, they learn that they are not, in fact, their mother's entire world, but then the mother has a life of their own and relationships to others. And, Freud argued, learning that one is not the sole object of one's mother's attention is inherently traumatic. It can feel like a betrayal. And given that the earliest of their mother's other relationships that a son of a heterosexual couple is likely to become aware of is that between their mother and their father, the father thus comes to be representative of the world's tearing away of one's mother from them. Now, there's much to be said about Freud's complete focus on boys to the exclusion of all others, and his assumption of a heterosexual relationship in which both mother and father are present with the child, and in which the mother takes on the role of the primary carer. Subsequent psychoanalytic scholars, including Carl Jung and Luce Irigaray, have sought to consider what the correlative experience might be for girls. For today, however, let's contain our focus to Freud and consider how we might be able to apply the notion of the Oedipus complex to Joker. For a key element to the plot of Joker is that Arthur's father isn't around. Arthur lives and has done all his life solely with his mother. If Arthur were one of Freud's patients, he would likely have much to say about this. The caring role that Arthur plays for his mother is perceived by others within the film as strange, as a relationship which is overly close. In fact, if, as Freud argued, dreams are the royal road to knowledge, then the audience's laughter when he tells Murray Franklin that he still lives with his mother in the aforementioned daydream is perhaps indicative that Arthur knows in his unconscious mind that this situation is viewed as odd by others. And this daydream is again insightful here, for through the theory of development offered to us by Freud, we might argue that the absence of a father figure to compromise the relationship between Arthur and his mother is a key element in his struggle to fit into the world around him. For few things within psychoanalysis are literal, and this extends to Freud's understanding of our relationships with our mothers and fathers. Whilst developing his concept of the Oedipus complex, Freud wrote in a letter, also to his good friend Fliess, that the father forbids the child from realising his unconscious wish to sleep with his mother. In this way, the father figure comes to represent the law, authority, and other forms of social norm. Where, in their early relationship with their mother, Freud's typical son believes themselves to have the complete, undiverted attention of their mother, in interceding upon this, the father begins a process by which that son is inculcated into the rules of the world around them. While the father might sever, to some extent, the child's relationship with their mother, the father introduces them, and is thus representative of, the legal and moral framework of the society around the child. While many of us might squirm at the implication in Freud's thinking here that to be the child of a single mother inherently leads to problems later in life, for the purposes of providing an introduction to it, we're going to attempt to remain sympathetic to Freud's work. And, in the case of Joker, which similarly channels some problematic tropes surrounding single mothers and the children of absent fathers, there do seem to be some commonalities. For from the very earliest moments of Joker, Arthur clearly struggles to comprehend the rules of the world around him. And this extends far beyond what the film clearly wants us to consider his overly close relationship with his mother. We see him at one point, for instance, attempting to note down the rules of stand-up comedy. Through watching other comics perform, he attempts to construct a formula for making people laugh. Predictably, this fails to improve his craft as a comedian. Through a psychoanalytic lens, we might argue then that not only does Arthur lack an understanding of the rules of the world around him, but he also lacks an understanding of the role that rules play in our lives. He fails to see that, while we do often choose to adhere to the norms of the world around us, at other times, for the sake of comedy say, we are required to break or to bend them. And this brings us back to Arthur's daydreams of appearing on Live with Murray Franklin. For, again, from a psychoanalytic point of view, one might argue that this is a prime example of Arthur's unconscious trauma surrounding not having a father figure in his life breaking through. We might interpret this dream as being less about actually appearing on Live with Murray Franklin, and more about the desire for a father figure. Murray's behaviour towards Arthur in this daydream certainly has an element of fatherliness to it. Murray thanks Arthur for looking after his mother and displays a degree of pride towards him. Furthermore, throughout the film, Murray is one of the sole sources of a coherent moral framework. At the film's climax, Murray tells him to avoid swearing on screen, and when things turn tense in his interview with Arthur, now Joker, he castigates him for what he views as an insensitive, immoral even, sense of humour. Arthur's search for a father figure obviously comes to be a central element to the plot in Act 2, when he learns that his mother believes that he is the son of Thomas Wayne. This comes to a painful resolution when Arthur first finds out that Wayne is far from the upstanding, compassionate individual that his mother has told him of, and then finds out that Wayne is not his father at all. It's no surprise then that the film ultimately resolves with Arthur sat next to Murray. The only person who has ever attempted to provide him with some kind of knowledge of the rules of the world around him, and who thus, in the Freudian understanding of the human mind, has more successfully fulfilled the father's role. So we've so far discussed psychoanalytic theory and Joker with reference to what Freud referred to as his topographical model of the human mind. This view of the human psyche, as comprised of the preconscious, conscious and unconscious minds, focuses primarily on how we store both factual and emotional information. Freud later developed this model, however, to revolve less around the store of information and more around processes and personality. In his 1923 book, The Ego and the Id, Freud suggested that the human personality contains within it three warring aspects: the superego, the ego, and the id. Now, there are some consistencies between Freud's two models. The superego can be said to have some relationship to the preconscious mind, the ego to the conscious mind, and the id to the unconscious mind. The key distinction is that where the former model portrayed these as sort of zones in which information is stored, this personality model reimagines them more clearly as active forces influencing our thoughts and behaviour. Following the conclusion of one's Oedipus complex, Freud writes that the superego retains the character of the father. The superego thus refers to the aspect of our personality which seeks to adhere to the legal and moral framework of the society around us. Almost directly opposed to this is the id, which Freud argued is the first part of our personality to develop and is thus the most primal in its priorities. The id seeks to push us towards pursuing our most basic instinctive urges. Mediating between what we might see as two extremes here is the ego. If the superego prioritizes high-minded ideals such as legality and morality, and the id primal urges for food or sexual gratification, the ego is the aspect of our personality most interested in how these relate to reality. The ego understands that we occasionally have to adjust our morals to a given situation, and that we occasionally do have to break the rules for certain reasons. The ego also understands that we can't simply follow our instinctual urges every waking second. Freud once wrote of the ego that, in its relationship to the id, it is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. It is, in some respects then, the mediator between the two warring factions of the superego and the id, which attempts to keep both in check. To return to a former filmic visit to Gotham City, Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight presents us with a useful analogy for the relationship between the superego, the ego, and the id. The latter aspect of Freud's conception of the human psyche is represented here by Heath Ledger's Joker. The Joker, in this iteration of the Batman story, is driven by a base urge for destruction. He might be the villain of the film, but there is no grand master plan here. Simply a desire to, as Alfred puts it, watch the world burn. The superego is represented by Harvey Dent, the district attorney frequently referred to as Gotham's White Knight. His campaign against organised crime seeks to uphold law and order and bring morality back to Gotham. Between these two figures sits Batman. Batman shares a similar goal to Dent, but recognises that ridding Gotham City of crime occasionally requires adjusting his moral framework and rendering a bad guy or two unconscious. Yet, although he might occasionally channel this id-like behaviour, he is also clearly opposed to the chaotic project of the Joker, and only engages these baser instincts in pursuit of a morally just end. We'll come back to how we might be able to apply a similar framework to Joker as a whole shortly. For now, let's continue discussing the character of Arthur Fleck as an individual. For throughout the film, we see Arthur wrestling with all three aspects of his psyche. His id, as one would imagine of a character who, throughout his previous iterations, has always sought chaos, is a strong presence. Some of the influences of Arthur's id we have already discussed. The childlike comfort he finds in his relationship with his mother, for instance, or his unconscious desire for a father figure. As the film proceeds, Arthur embraces his id to an ever greater extent. After he murders a Wall Street trader in self-defense, he seemingly gets a taste for blood and for revenge. First he murders the trader's friends, and then later he lets his id take over once again when he exacts his revenge upon his co-worker Randall, who was a key contributor to Arthur getting fired from his job. By the end of the film, Arthur has seemingly succumbed entirely to the will of his id, as, whilst disavowing the politics of the kill the rich movement that has risen up on the streets of Gotham City, he revelled in the chaos it has unleashed. It is worth noting, however, that it is not as if Arthur suddenly relents to these base instincts and desires. In fact, up to and including the murder of the first Wall Street trader, Arthur's superego, the part of his psyche which prioritises high-minded ideals such as morality, still holds considerable sway. I've already discussed the manner in which we might read Murray Franklin as a kind of stand-in for a father within Arthur's mind. Yet Arthur finds other father figures throughout the film. The clearest is Thomas Wayne, who, for a time at least, he believes to be his biological father. Randall, too, however, also plays a father-like role to Arthur. He refers to Arthur as "my boy," and when Randall first gives Arthur the gun, there is an extent to which he is actually trying to help him. It is not only a gun that Randall gives Arthur, though. As Freud argued was the role of the father figure, the gift of a gun is also symbolic of the gift of a moral framework. It is a very different moral framework to that which Murray Franklin subscribes. Randall is implicitly suggesting here that it is okay to shoot someone in self-defense, yet it is a moral framework nonetheless. As he swings between different replacements for his absent father, then, Arthur's superego also swings between different moral understandings of the world. Between Arthur's Ede, keen to exact revenge for his social marginalisation, and his confused superego, reaching for a moral framework through which to engage with the world, is Arthur's ego, which just wants to fit in and get on with life. We perhaps see this most clearly in his sessions with his social worker and in his journal. At one point, Arthur writes that the worst part about having a mental illness is that people expect you to behave as if you don't. Tragically, Arthur's ego drives him towards trying to act as though he is in mental good health and towards attempting to fit in. Despite the weakness of his act, perhaps it is when he is attempting to do comedy that his ego is most in control. For comedy often thrives by engaging both the base instincts of our id and our superego's sense of morality. So far in this video, we've taken a similar approach to Joker as to that which Freud might have taken in his clinic. We focused in on the character of Arthur Flack and interpreted his dreams and what we know about his familial circumstances in order to speculate over the conclusions that a clinical psychoanalyst might come to about his mental state. Joker, however, is not only a study of the psyche of one individual. In its foregrounding of issues of inequality and social marginalisation, it also aims at some level of societal and political critique. Psychoanalytic theory can also be of some use to us in interpreting this dimension of the film too. For from Freud onwards, psychoanalytic theorists have sought not only to interpret the psyche of individuals, but also that of society at large. This is something we'll focus on more in a future video in which we'll look at the work of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who, counter to Freud's view of psychoanalysis as a science, developed a more philosophical approach. One way in which psychoanalytic philosophers have sought to use Freud's insights, and those which have been developed since, to interpret the psyche of society more broadly, is through the analysis of film. This is most evident in the work of Slavoj Žižek, who regularly seeks to tease out a psychoanalytic understanding of life under late capitalism, with references to the films that society produces. Todd McGowan explains the rationale behind using film as an insight into the society around it with reference to Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, writing that psychoanalysis makes its most important discoveries through the analysis of dreams. And to this day, the cinema remains a dream factory, a form of public dreaming. In this way, scholars such as Žižek have sought to use these public dreams as an insight into the public psyche. Let's close out this video then by considering what Joker might reveal about our collective desires and anxieties at the end of the second decade of the 21st century. Earlier, I discussed the manner in which the Dark Knight might be viewed in relation to Freud's model of personality. I suggested that we might view Heath Ledger's Joker as the id, Aaron Eckhart's Harvey Dent as the superego, and Christian Bale's Batman as the ego. Joker, in the fatherly figure of Murray Franklin, has its own superego, who foregrounds morality and common understandings of what is and is not acceptable. It also has an id in the form, one might argue, of Arthur's mother, who is obsessed with the idea of reconnecting with the man she misremembers to have been her former lover, and later in Arthur, or Joker, himself. There is no Batman in Joker, however. Bruce Wayne is still a child, with his journey to becoming the Batman still decades ahead. In fact, he doesn't utter a single line throughout the film. Although, as I've discussed, Arthur's ego does make some attempt to assert itself towards the beginning of the film, as the plot proceeds, this kind of influence is increasingly absent. And this holds true not only for Arthur, but for the film as a whole. Joker thus presents us with a vision of the world in which the mediating force of the ego is increasingly absent. The base urges of the id and the overly moralistic thinking of the superego are thus able to burst out unfettered. As often in film, this is best observed not in any of the main characters, but in those which populate the background of its scenes. For the kill the rich movement, which emerges throughout Joker, brings together these two aspects of the personality. Its id-like behaviours are readily apparent in the wanton destruction it brings to the streets of Gotham. Yet, these riots are also a moral reaction to a world that those participating see as increasingly unjust. So, to conclude, there is much to be critiqued in Joker's representation of mental ill health. It adheres to a reified perception of those with mental illness diagnoses as in some way inherently prone to violence, which is simply untrue. Psychoanalysis, too, has its problems. Paul Salkowski's, professor of clinical psychology and applied science at the University of Bath, wrote in a 2011 issue of the British Medical Journal that psychoanalysis has no place in modern mental health services. Not only is there no evidence base for the treatment, but there is no empirical grounding for the key constructs underpinning it. There are, it must be said, some studies which show that psychoanalysis can be of benefit to patients, yet this in no way serves to prove that any of Freud's theses about the human psyche are correct in the scientific sense. I have also pointed to some of the assumptions that psychoanalytic theory, as developed by Freud, makes about familial situations and its prioritization of the experience of boys and men above all others. Subsequent scholars have sought to amend some of Freud's concepts, often from a decidedly feminist perspective. Some of these developments I hope to cover in future videos. Psychoanalytic theory, however, remains a useful basis for considering the relationship between our intentional thought, our baser urges, and the legal and moral frameworks of the world around us. It is, ultimately, a philosophy of desire. It reminds us that understanding the world cannot solely be achieved through analysing institutions and the societal forces they set in motion, but also the desiring subjects which populate it. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it useful or interesting in some way, then do please consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks as always to Ash, to J. Fraser Cartwright, to Michael V. Brown, to Sindri Nielsen, to Army of Me, and to Kaya Lau for being signed up to the top tier of my Patreon. If you would like to join them in supporting what I do here whilst getting early access to videos and copies of the scripts to them, then you can do so by heading to patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much once again for watching, and have a great week.